Sunday morning, a packed church in Atlanta, Georgia. The choir sings, hands are raised in worship, and at the center of it all stands Pastor Michael. Charismatic, respected, a man of God. His sermon echoes through the building, commanding the room. Then, chaos. The doors burst open. 4 armed men storm in, guns raised, barking orders. Panic spreads. Screams fill the air. People hit the ground, shielding their children, gripping their loved ones. The intruders aren't here to rob, to threaten, or to harm anyone else. They're here for one man. Pastor Michael. They pull him from the pulpit, dragging him down the aisle as his congregation watches in horror. He doesn't resist, maybe because he knows exactly why this is happening. Within minutes, he's gone. The men vanish, taking him with them. By the time police arrive, there's no trace, no demands, no ransom call, nothing. Who wanted Pastor Michael taken? His devoted wife? His overbearing mother? His secret lovers, or someone else entirely? What investigators would uncover in the coming days would shake the church, the community, and everyone who ever believed they knew who Pastor Michael really was. Pastor Michael and Natasha's were high school sweethearts, bonded by faith, love, and years of shared history. The community adored them. Their congregation saw them as a model couple, proof that God's love could hold anything together. Natasha had never been an open book. Her past wasn't something she wore on her sleeve. Few knew about the dark childhood she had barely survived. Raised by a single mother after her father's death in prison, Natasha's life had been marked by trauma long before she met Michael. Her father had been a monster in human skin, a man who saw his own daughter as property. The abuse started young, and by the time she was a teenager, she had endured multiple pregnancies, each one forcefully ended by her own mother, a mother who saw silence as survival. One of those abortions went wrong. The damage was permanent. Doctors told her the truth she had no choice but to accept. Pregnancy would never be safe for her again. She told Michael everything back in college. She expected him to walk away. Most men would have. Instead, he held her hand, looked her in the eye, and told her he didn't care. God can do anything, he said. We'll get through this. So they got married. For 3 years, he meant those words. Through the whispered questions at church, the family pressure, the tension at home, he held his ground. But love has limits, and his patience, no matter how deep, wasn't endless. Somewhere along the way, Michael changed. Maybe it was Tanya's constant disapproval, her passive-aggressive remarks about a man needing a legacy. Maybe it was watching his friends start families while he came home to a wife who could never give him one. Maybe it was something deeper, something he never admitted, even to himself. Whatever it was, it happened slowly. But once it started, it couldn't be stopped. By year 3, he stopped saying, "We'll get through this." Instead, he started asking why he had to. At first, it was just small comments, offhanded remarks about adoption, jokes about how much he wanted a son. Natasha felt it all, but what could she do? She couldn't change the past, she couldn't give him what he wanted, and she couldn't stop what was coming next. Because while Michael was drifting away from her, Tanya, his mother, was pulling him toward someone else. And once she set her plan in motion, there would be no turning back. Tanya had never liked Natasha. She played her role well, smiling in public, nodding along when her son spoke about God's plan for his marriage. But behind closed doors, she made her feelings clear. Natasha was a mistake, a dead end, a woman who couldn't give Michael a future. For 3 years, she watched in silent frustration as her son wasted his best years on a woman who could never give him a child. It wasn't fair. Not to Michael, not to her, not to the family name. And so Tanya made a decision. If Natasha couldn't give Michael a child, then someone else would. It started with careful planning. A conversation here. A suggestion there. Tanya had friends, women who understood her frustration, who had daughters of their own. Young women, beautiful and eager, who would make the perfect wife if only Michael would open his eyes. One name kept coming up: Georgina. She had grown up around the church, always admiring Michael from afar. Smart, respectful, everything Tanya wanted in a daughter-in-law. More importantly, she was willing. The plan was simple. Tanya invited Michael over for dinner, just like she had done 100 times before. No suspicion. No reason for him to think twice. Only this time the drink she gave him wasn't just wine. By the time Georgina arrived, Michael was barely conscious, and by the next morning, the damage was done. Few weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. Michael's world shattered the moment Tanya told him the truth. He didn't remember anything, but the evidence was clear. There was no denying it. Georgina was carrying his child. He had spent years holding on to his faith, trying to believe that he and Natasha were meant to be, that their love could withstand anything. Now, in a single night, everything had changed. Tanya called it a blessing. Michael called it a nightmare. And Natasha? She had no idea. Because what Tanya didn't know, what even Michael hadn't admitted yet, was that Georgina wasn't the only one. While his mother had been forcing his hand, Michael had already made a choice of his own. Miles away, in a quiet part of town where no one from the church would ever look, another woman was carrying his child. Her name was Mary, and unlike Georgina, she hadn't needed anyone to push her into Michael's arms. He had gone willingly, and now he had 2 women pregnant at the same time. Tanya thought she had forced Michael into fatherhood. She believed that by taking matters into her own hands, she had given him what he needed, a way out of his barren marriage. But she had no idea that Michael had already beaten her to it. Because 6 months before Georgina ever got pregnant, Michael had met someone else. It had started far from home, an international pastors' conference in Chicago, a week-long event where preachers, church leaders, and faith-based entrepreneurs gathered to expand their ministry. But for Michael, that week had expanded something else entirely. He met Mary on the second day. She was from New Orleans, working behind the scenes at the event, handling logistics. At first, it was just small talk, professional. But there was something about her, her confidence, the way she saw him not just as a pastor, but as a man. That first conversation led to another, then a dinner, then another. By the end of the week, Michael had crossed a line he could never uncross. It wasn't just lust. It wasn't just a one-night mistake. It was an affair, and one that didn't stop after the conference ended. They stayed in touch. Secret phone calls, hidden meetings, trips Michael justified as ministry work. And as the months passed, their relationship deepened. Until the day Mary called him with news that changed everything. She was pregnant. Michael was drowning. He had spent years convincing himself that his marriage was strong enough, that he could resist temptation. Now he had 2 women pregnant at the same time, and neither one knew about the other. Mary was 6 months along when Tanya finally revealed what she had done. At first, Michael didn't tell her about Mary. He was still trying to wrap his head around what his mother had done, how she had drugged him, stripped him of his choice. He was angry, but what could he do? The damage was done. Georgina was pregnant, and Tanya was already making plans. She spoke of the child like it was the best thing that had ever happened. Michael felt trapped. He couldn't tell his mother the truth, not yet. He needed time to think. But time was something he didn't have, because Mary wasn't staying silent. She had been patient for months, keeping their secret, waiting for Michael to figure out how to handle things. But when she found out that Georgina existed, and that Michael was planning to claim another woman's child first, her patience ran out. She wanted answers. She wanted to be part of his life, not his secret. And she wasn't going to wait much longer. Michael was losing control. 2 women, 2 pregnancies, 1 wife who still had no idea, and a storm was coming. It happened on a Saturday night. The night before, everything unraveled. Michael's phone had been ringing all evening. First it was Mary, then Georgina. He ignored both calls at first, but the messages they left made it clear avoiding them wasn't an option anymore. Mary had found out about Georgina. She didn't say how, but her tone was different this time. No more softness, no more waiting. She wanted answers. She wanted to know why he had lied, why he had made her believe she was the only one. When Michael finally called her back, she didn't hold back. She told him she wasn't going to be a secret anymore. She was carrying his child, and she expected him to act like a father. Before he could even process that conversation, Georgina called next. Her words hit even harder. She wasn't giving him a choice. She was done hiding, done waiting, and done being strung along. She was coming to church tomorrow, and if he didn't handle things before then, she would do it for him. By the time the calls ended, Michael sat in silence. There was no way out of this. Everything, his marriage, his reputation, his future, was now hanging by a thread. Sunday morning came faster than he expected. Michael stepped into church, his sermon prepared, his mask still intact. He didn't know if Georgina was serious. Would she actually show up? Would she ruin him in front of his congregation? Or had he somehow, by the grace of God, survived this disaster? He never got the chance to find out. Sunday morning, the congregation had gathered as usual, filling the room with hymns and worship. Pastor Michael stood at the pulpit, delivering his sermon with the same conviction as always. To his followers, he was their spiritual leader, a man anointed to guide them. No one knew that just hours earlier, his world had been on the verge of collapse. Despite everything that had unfolded the night before, the confrontation, the threats, Michael had chosen to act like nothing had happened. Maybe he thought Georgina had calmed down. Maybe he assumed Mary had walked away for good. Or maybe he simply refused to believe that his carefully constructed life was unraveling faster than he could control. But as the service went on, something shifted. The double doors at the back of the church swung open violently. A group of 4 masked men, armed and moving with precision, stormed inside. The room fell silent for a brief second before panic erupted. People gasped, screamed, dropped to the floor. Some clung to their loved ones. Others instinctively reached for their phones. But the intruders weren't there for money, or valuables, or even to make a general statement. They were there for one person. They moved swiftly, cutting through the aisles, heading straight for the pulpit, straight for Michael. There was no struggle, no attempt to resist. Witnesses later recalled that Michael didn't even try to run. Maybe he was frozen in fear. Maybe he knew exactly why this was happening. Maybe he had seen it coming. Within seconds, the men grabbed him, forcing him away from the podium, dragging him down the aisle as the congregation watched in stunned horror. A few people tried to intervene. One usher attempted to block their path but was shoved to the ground. A woman screamed for someone to call the police. But by the time anyone could react, it was already too late. The men forced Michael out of the building and into a waiting black SUV parked just outside. Tires screeched as the vehicle sped off, disappearing before anyone could get a clear look at the plates. By the time law enforcement arrived, there was nothing left behind except chaos and unanswered questions. The first few hours after Michael's abduction were filled with confusion. The authorities scrambled to piece together what had happened. The congregation was in shock. This wasn't a random attack. It was planned. The first question investigators asked was the most obvious. Who would want Pastor Michael kidnapped? At first glance, he was a respected man, a leader, a devoted husband. But as detectives began digging deeper, cracks started to show. Michael had secrets, and those secrets had finally caught up with him. Law enforcement wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. The first step was determining whether this was a ransom case. But as hours passed, no calls came in, no demands. Whoever had taken Michael hadn't done it for money. This was personal. Detectives began retracing Michael's steps in the days leading up to the incident. They needed to answer one question. Who would want him gone? It didn't take long for Michael's personal life to become the focus. At first glance, he was a devoted husband, but the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated things became. His marriage to Natasha was far from perfect. Those closest to them admitted that Michael had been distant, distracted. The word infidelity came up more than once, but no one had details, just whispers, suspicions. Then came Georgina. It took detectives less than 24 hours to learn about her pregnancy. A young woman, visibly pregnant, connected to the pastor. It was impossible to ignore. Georgina was brought in for questioning. Her attitude was defensive from the start. She admitted she was carrying Michael's child, but claimed she had nothing to do with the kidnapping. "I wouldn't do that," she told investigators. But she didn't seem surprised that someone else had. When asked who might have wanted to hurt Michael, she hesitated. Eventually, she gave detectives a name: Mary. By the time authorities reached Mary, she was already aware that the investigation had turned toward her. Unlike Georgina, Mary didn't hold back. She confirmed the affair. She confirmed her pregnancy. And then, she confirmed something else. Michael had been trying to keep both women under control, juggling 2 pregnancies, 2 different women, both demanding more from him than he was willing to give. Mary admitted that the night before the kidnapping, things had escalated. He was losing control, she said. When detectives pressed for details, she refused to say more. But one thing was clear: Michael wasn't just a victim of an abduction. He was a man who had made enemies. Throughout the initial investigation, one person's behavior stood out the most: Natasha. She had shown up at the station briefly after the abduction, but she hadn't stayed long. A few officers noted that her reaction seemed measured. Not hysterical, not frantic, just calm. That calmness wasn't lost on the detectives. Then came the witness statement, the one that placed Natasha in the back of the church just before the kidnapping. She hadn't been sitting with the congregation. She had been watching. Investigators had more questions than answers. Where had Michael been taken? Who was behind it? But one thing was becoming painfully clear. This was not a random crime. Someone had planned this, and whoever was responsible knew exactly what they were doing. As the investigation deepened, the pieces of Michael's life began falling into place. The perfect pastor, the devoted husband. None of it was real. He had spent years crafting an image, but in the end, his own decisions had created the enemies that led to his disappearance. But one thing was still missing. Where was he? Days passed, and there was still no sign of Michael. No ransom demands. No communication. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But then, a breakthrough. A traffic camera from a street about 5 miles from the church had captured a black SUV matching the description given by witnesses. The timestamp? 7 minutes after the abduction. The footage showed the vehicle making a sharp turn down an isolated road leading to an abandoned warehouse. Law enforcement moved fast. When they arrived, the SUV was gone. But inside the building they found something else. The warehouse was cold, empty, and silent. But investigators quickly noticed the signs. Scuff marks on the floor, a broken chair, ropes discarded in the corner, and then, the biggest discovery, a drop of blood near the door. The forensics team moved in, confirming what detectives already suspected. Michael had been here. But where was he now? A break came when investigators canvassed the area, looking for potential witnesses. Most of the nearby buildings were abandoned, but one local security guard had been working that night. He told detectives he had seen 2 vehicles parked outside the warehouse around midnight. The black SUV and another car, a gray sedan. When asked if he got a good look at the driver, he shook his head. It was too dark, but he remembered something strange. "The person who got out of that car wasn't a man," he said. It was a woman. Investigators had already been suspicious of Natasha's behavior after the kidnapping. But now, they had two separate reports placing her at crucial moments. First, inside the church, watching from a distance before the abduction. Now, outside the warehouse, hours later. Her silence was becoming harder to ignore. Detectives decided to bring Natasha in for formal questioning. They needed answers. At first, she maintained her role as the worried wife. She answered carefully, showing just enough emotion to seem convincing. But then, they asked a simple question. "Where were you the night after the abduction?" Her response was immediate. She said she had been home, alone. But there was one problem. Her phone record said otherwise. Her device had pinged off a cell tower less than 3 miles from the warehouse that night. For the first time since the investigation began, Natasha had been caught in a lie. And now, detectives knew for certain, she was hiding something. With Natasha caught in a lie, the investigation took a sharp turn. What had once seemed like a kidnapping with unknown motives was now looking more like a deliberate act of revenge. But investigators still had one major problem. Michael was still missing. After confirming that Natasha's phone had pinged near the warehouse, law enforcement returned to the area for a more thorough search. This time, they expanded their perimeter, looking beyond the building. What they found changed the case completely. About half a mile away, in a ditch near the roadside, a body was discovered. It was Michael. His clothes were torn, his hands bore signs of restraint, and most telling of all, he had been shot. But the details of his injuries raised even more questions. The bullet wound wasn't from close range, suggesting he had been trying to escape when he was killed. This wasn't a pre-planned execution. Something had gone wrong. Forensic analysis of the scene revealed several footprints leading away from the warehouse. Investigators pieced together what had likely happened. At some point, Michael had managed to break free. He had made it out of the warehouse, running toward the road, toward potential help. But someone had followed him, and before he could make it to safety, a single shot ended it all. Just when detectives were piecing this theory together, an unexpected witness came forward. One of the kidnappers, faced with mounting pressure, decided to talk. He didn't just admit to taking part in the crime. He provided the final missing detail. Natasha had orchestrated the entire thing. According to the witness, she had learned the full extent of Michael's betrayal days before the abduction. She had found out about Georgina, about Mary, about the pregnancies, about everything. And she had snapped. She didn't plan to kill him. That wasn't the goal. She wanted him to suffer. She wanted him to feel trapped, powerless, just like she had felt for years. The plan was simple. Abduct him, make him feel fear, then release him. Broken. But Michael fought back. He had gotten loose, tried to run. And in the heat of the moment, everything fell apart. Natasha's revenge had turned into murder. With this confession, authorities had what they needed. Natasha was arrested and charged. As the trial unfolded, the public saw a woman who had endured years of silent pain, who had been pushed beyond her breaking point. But in the eyes of the law, there was no justification for what she had done. She had planned it, arranged it, and when it went wrong, she let it happen anyway. The case was closed. But for those who knew them, there would always be one lingering question. Who was truly the villain? Natasha's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. To those who had known her, the idea that she had orchestrated her own husband's abduction and murder seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. Law enforcement pieced together the final timeline leading up to the crime. 6 days before the abduction, Natasha received a call from Tanya. Michael's mother finally told her everything about Georgina, about the baby. She urged Natasha to leave, to accept reality. 4 days before the abduction, Natasha dug deeper and discovered something even worse, Mary's pregnancy. She had been betrayed not once, but twice. 3 days before the abduction, Natasha reached out to someone. Call records showed multiple communications between her and an unknown number, later traced to one of the kidnappers. This was premeditated. Michael's mother, Tanya, became a key figure in the case. After all, she had played a role in setting up his affair with Georgina. Did she know what Natasha was planning? When questioned, Tanya denied any involvement. She admitted she had told Natasha about the affairs, but claimed she never expected her to do something like this. Investigators found no proof that Tanya had taken part in the crime. But some people in the community weren't convinced, because whether or not she intended it, Tanya had lit the match. For Natasha, prosecutors painted her as a woman consumed by jealousy and revenge, willing to do anything to make her husband pay. The defense, however, told a different story. They highlighted her trauma, the years of pain she had endured, the public humiliation, the betrayal. They argued that she had only meant to scare Michael, not to kill him, that his death had been an accident, a consequence of his own desperate attempt to escape. But the jury wasn't swayed. The verdict came in guilty. Natasha was convicted of orchestrating the kidnapping, leading to her husband's death. The sentence was severe: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case was closed, but one final chapter remained: the fallout. Because even though justice had been served, the damage had already been done. The case was over. Natasha was convicted, sentenced to life in prison, and the headlines: Tanya, once the proud mother who had fought for her son's legacy, was left with nothing. She had set the events in motion, pushing Michael toward Georgina, believing she was securing his future. Instead, she had unknowingly led him to his grave. Her only son was gone. The grandchild she had hoped for would never know his father. And in the end, she was just as alone as Natasha was. For Georgina and Mary, the aftermath was different, but no less painful. Georgina had expected a life beside Michael, believing that Tanya's interference had secured her a future. Instead, she was left with a child and a reputation she would never escape. Mary, on the other hand, vanished from the public eye. She had lost more than a lover. She had lost the illusion of what she thought they had. Natasha never spoke publicly after her sentencing. She never gave interviews, never tried to justify herself. To the outside world, she was a woman who had snapped, let rage consume her, and paid the ultimate price. But those who knew her never agreed on whether she was truly guilty in the way the court had decided. Was she a cold-blooded mastermind who had planned Michael's fate from the moment she learned the truth? Or was she simply a broken woman, pushed too far by betrayal, heartbreak, and a lifetime of pain? In the end, it didn't matter. She would never see the outside world again, a reminder that choices have consequences, and that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who can destroy us. The case was closed, but the story would never be forgotten. Michael had everything: power, influence, a wife who stood by his side. But in the end, none of it could save him. If you found this case as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe. Because in the world of crime, there's always another dark story waiting to be told. We are not happy they happen, but we are here to make sure you are educated so you can live cautiously. See you in the next video.